What if the most famous story in human history, a miraculous virgin birth, a specially chosen divine intercessor, and a resurrection on the exact third day, didn't actually originate in the Middle East?
I mean, that premise alone, it completely short-circuits the historical timeline most of us were taught in school, right?
Right, absolutely. Like, what if that specific sequence of events was actively being taught, memorized, and practiced in West Africa long before European ships ever even thought about dropping anchor on the coastline?
It really challenges centuries of established dogma regarding global spirituality, like where our foundational religious narratives actually come from and, who influenced who.
Exactly. And welcome to today's deep dive. We're digging deep into the ancient Yoruba tradition of Ifa and how ancient African spirituality parallels and perhaps even secretly influenced modern Orthodox religion.
And right off the bat, if you are listening to this, you should know we are walking into some highly charged historical territory today.
Yeah, for sure.
Neither of us is here to take a side. We aren't here to endorse the theological viewpoints, and we certainly aren't here to dismiss them either.
Right. Our goal is simply to act as your impartial guides through the author's claims. We just want to understand the arguments, explore the mechanisms behind the history, and really look at the timeline the text presents.
So whether you love exploring alternative history, or you're just insanely curious about how human belief systems evolve and intersect over centuries, this deep dive is going to challenge how you view the roots of global faith.
Definitely. And to really grasp these massive parallels, we have to start at the bedrock of Yoruba spirituality. Just like Christianity relies heavily on the Bible or Islam on the Quran, the Ifa tradition relies on a massive foundational archive called the Odu Ifa.
Right, though calling it just a text or an archive almost undersells the mechanics of it, I think.
Yeah, how so?
Well, the author makes a point to emphasize that this isn't a simple collection of fables passed around a campfire. The Odu Ifa is constructed in a highly advanced numeric binary form consisting of 256 specific chapters.
Wait, when you say binary form, we're talking about like base 2 mathematics, like the ones and zeros used in computer programming.
The exact same mathematical principle.
Wow.
Yeah. To understand how this works mechanically, you have to look at the traditional Ifa divination process. A priest uses a specific divination chain, which traditionally holds 8 half shells, or palm nuts.
Okay.
And when this chain is cast down, each of those 8 shells can land in one of 2 physical positions. They're either open, facing up, or closed, facing down.
I see. So an open shell is essentially acting as a 1, and a closed shell is acting as a 0.
You got it. Mathematically, if you have 8 variables that each have 2 possible states, that generates exactly 256 possible outcomes.
And each of those outcomes is a chapter.
Exactly. Each of those unique binary combinations corresponds to one specific chapter of the Odu Ifa. And the author highlights that this ancient binary system is the exact foundational logic used today to build modern computing and explain advanced physics.
That is wild.
Right. The Yoruba were using a base 2 system to categorize vast amounts of knowledge, spanning from the physical creation of the universe down to the intricacies of human destiny.
I mean, think of this like discovering ancient computer code. The Odu Ifa essentially acts like the base operating system for understanding reality.
That's a great way to put it.
It just completely shatters that pervasive colonial narrative, the one that portrays ancient Africa as this primitive place just wandering in the dark waiting to be civilized.
Oh, totally. The author makes a very compelling case that an advanced society doesn't just mean one with industrial machinery. It means possessing complex, mathematically structured systems of knowledge.
Right. The historical colonizers' narrative relied heavily on portraying indigenous cultures as intellectually vacant in order to justify intervention.
Exactly. But the mechanical reality of the Odu Ifa presents a profound intellectual architecture that predates European contact by centuries.
So let's look at the actual narrative content stored inside that ancient operating system. The very first binary chapter, known as Iji Ogbe, contains a story that is going to sound incredibly familiar to anyone raised in the Christian faith.
It really is. It centers on a young woman named Oyej. And according to the oral traditions preserved in Iji Ogbe, Oyez was a virgin who desperately wanted a child, which, carried a heavy social and emotional burden in the ancient world.
Right.
So seeking a miracle, she consults the very first Ifa priest, Orunmila. He prophesies that she will miraculously conceive a special male child.
And the story goes that 6 months later, without ever knowing a man, she's undeniably pregnant. The priests and Oyej herself are in absolute shock.
Right, it's a huge deal.
She eventually gives birth to a boy, and she names him Ila. His life trajectory is detailed in a very specific way, too. He grows up in the spiritual shrine, he never marries, and he devotes his entire existence to the priesthood and to spiritual work.
Yeah, and his role eventually elevates far beyond just being a dedicated priest. When his mentor, Orunmila, is preparing to ascend to heaven, the instruction left for the people is that any future communication with the divine must go through Ila.
So he becomes the designated bridge.
He becomes the ultimate intercessor. And then, when Ila himself is finally ready to depart the earth, he leaves one critical final instruction. He tells his followers that whenever they need to ask God for anything, they must call his name, Ila's name, 3 times, and he will intercede to answer their prayers.
Okay, I have to stop here and push back on the book's premise a bit.
Sure, go for it.
Because, this sounds word for word like the Christian story of Jesus, down to the virgin birth, the devoted life, and the role as the ultimate intercessor. How does the author actually prove the timeline here? Because my immediate skeptical thought is that European missionaries arrived, preached the gospel, and the locals just, absorbed or adapted the Jesus story into their own mythology.
Which is a completely fair point, right?
Yeah.
That is the primary question skeptics and historians raise. But the author counters this by explaining how the timeline is verified through linguistic analysis and anthropological dating.
Okay, how does that work?
Well, the Odu Ifa wasn't just spoken casually. It was preserved in highly rigid, rhythmic praise poetry that priests had to memorize syllable by syllable.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and because of that strict memorization protocol, the linguistic dialect gets locked in time. Linguists analyzing the specific verses about Ila can see that the vocabulary and grammatical structures are incredibly archaic.
I see.
They far predate the linguistic shifts that happen around the time of European contact.
So the actual language used to tell the story of the virgin birth is demonstrably older than the arrival of the missionaries.
Exactly. Furthermore, oral historians cross-reference these verses with parallel traditions in isolated neighboring regions that had zero contact with early missionaries. The concept of a divine, virgin-born intercessor was already an established indigenous truth.
Meaning, when the missionaries finally showed up preaching about a virgin birth and a special son who acts as an intercessor, the Yoruba people weren't hearing a brand new revolutionary concept.
Right.
They were essentially hearing a variation of something they already had recorded in their own base 2 code.
Exactly. And the parallels extend beyond just the birth and life of Ila. They map directly onto the afterlife, too.
Okay.
Because alongside the virgin birth, the other major theological pillar of the Christian faith is the resurrection of Christ on the 3rd day.
Right. It's the absolute cornerstone of the theology.
According to the author, the concept of a 3rd-day resurrection was deeply embedded in Yoruba burial rites long before any Orthodox church was built in West Africa.
That's it.
Well, traditional Yoruba burials are deeply intimate. When a person passes away, they aren't cast off to an isolated, lonely graveyard. They are carefully washed, dressed in their finest white clothes, and traditionally buried within the family home itself.
Inside the home.
Yeah, the family stays close, safely speaking to the departed spirit overnight to guide them through the transition.
Which brings us to the significance of that exact 3rd day.
Right. The ancient Yoruba belief dictates that every person's spirit resurrects on the 3rd day. Not just a specific deity or chosen prophet, but everyone.
Wow, okay.
And to facilitate this, they perform a highly specific ritual called the breaking of the calabash. For those who might not be familiar, a calabash is a dried, hollowed-out gourd, traditionally used as a bowl or a vessel.
Right.
But in this ritual context, the calabash physically represents the vessel of the human body.
And the details of this ritual are incredibly vivid. You have virgin boys and virgin girls gather together holding special sticks. They break that symbolic calabash, they call the deceased person's name 3 times, and the spirit is officially released from the physical vessel.
It's a moment of eruption, not somber weeping. The family starts singing and dancing because they know the spirit has risen.
That's beautiful.
And from there, the spirit travels to a place of divine judgment, where the deeds of their life will be read from a spiritual book.
If you grew up learning standard world history, this completely flips the script you were taught. The idea of passing away, resurrecting on the exact 3rd day, and facing a book of divine judgment was a standard Yoruba rite of passage.
Exactly.
It wasn't a theology exported to Africa. It was a sacred reality every traditional person went through.
And that realization makes you rethink the early interactions between the indigenous populations and the colonizers.
Yeah.
If these profound practices were already foundational, what actually happened when colonizers started forcing Orthodox churches, the Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists, and Catholics onto the continent.
Well, the author points out that the early Orthodox churches brought by the colonizers were designed to be highly rigid. You sit in a pew, you sing a quiet hymn, you listen to a reading, and you go home quietly.
Right, very orderly, very subdued.
Yeah. No speaking in tongues, no falling under the anointing, no explosive dancing in the aisles.
But if you walk into many modern African Christian churches today, that is the polar opposite of what you see. You see high-energy dancing, intense drum rolls, miraculous healings, explosive spiritual manifestations.
Yeah.
The author asks, where did that vibrant worship style come from?
And the book's answer is that it came straight from ancient African spirituality. Africans didn't just magically erase their culture when forced into foreign churches. They engaged in brilliant syncretism. They mapped their indigenous deities directly onto the new Christian framework.
It's a cultural Trojan horse.
Yes, exactly. They outwardly accepted the new religion to survive, but successfully smuggled their ancient, vibrant Yoruba practices right past the colonizers by disguising them as Christian worship.
And the mechanics of how they achieved this are fascinating. Take Shango, for example.
The deity of fire.
Right, the Yoruba deity of fire, thunder, music, and drums. Followers of Shango couldn't openly worship him without facing severe punishment, so they brought their intense dancing and rhythmic drum rolls straight into the Christian service, directing that same ancient fervor toward the Christian God.
That makes so much sense.
The text even notes that some of the passionate praise names used for God in African churches today, like calling God the one clothed in fire, aren't actually found anywhere in the Bible. The one clothed in fire is a traditional ancient praise name for Shango.
Wow. And they did this with other deities too, right? Followers of Ocean, the deity of healing waters and fertility, are the ones who brought the concept of using holy water for miracles into the church space.
Exactly. Then you have Obatala, the deity associated with speaking incredible miracles into existence without the use of herbs or medicine. The author argues that the followers of Obatala heavily shaped the massive modern deliverance and healing services we see in African Christianity today.
Right.
The worship style didn't organically evolve from the Anglican hymn book. It was a direct, localized transplant of indigenous practice as a brilliant act of cultural survival.
But that brilliant survival tactic raises a massive contradiction, doesn't it? If Yoruba spirituality was mathematically complex with its binary code, linguistically verified through ancient poetry, and powerful enough to literally shape modern African Christianity, why is it so heavily demonized today? Like, why is there such a stigma?
This shifts the conversation into the psychology of colonial control and how empires historically use spiritual assimilation as a weapon.
Right.
You can't just physically dominate a population. To maintain total control, you have to systematically dismantle their psychological reliance on their own culture. If an empire wants to make a population dependent on them for salvation, they have to convince that population that they are fundamentally lost and spiritually empty without the empire's intervention.
Because you can't subjugate people, steal their resources, dehumanize them, and then politely hand them a Bible and expect them to willingly adopt your religion on a silver platter. It requires aggressive psychological manipulation.
Right. The author gives a prime example regarding the use of herbs. Colonizers couldn't claim they invented the local African plants because the locals had been growing them and using their medicinal secrets for centuries.
Obviously.
So they drew a manipulative line. They labeled the physical, nutritional use of the plants as fine, but the spiritual use of those exact same herbs in a traditional healing context was suddenly labeled demonic.
And they manipulated the imagery, too, portraying angels as pristine and white while depicting the devil and anything evil as dark or black. It sends a subtle, constant psychological message that anything resembling an African is inherently unholy.
Yes. They also actively targeted the power structures in the community, specifically older, spiritually powerful women. These women held deep community authority and couldn't be easily dominated by colonial men.
So what did they do?
They labeled them as witches and banished them. It severed generational wisdom. When you make an entire generation look at their own grandmothers with fear, you leave the youth unmoored and vulnerable to whatever new system you want to impose.
Man, that psychological manipulation didn't stop with herbs or imagery, though. They applied that exact same tactic of demonization to the very bloodlines of the people.
Right.
The author points out a glaring hypocrisy regarding ancestors. Why are modern Christians perfectly comfortable praying for the blessings of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Those were men who lived and died in the Middle East centuries before Christ was even born. They are the literal ancestors of the Jewish people.
Exactly.
But the second an African person wants to honor their own grandfathers or great-grandfathers, it is immediately labeled as demonic idol worship. How does that make any logical sense?
Logically, it doesn't. But as a tool of empire, it makes perfect sense. By demonizing African ancestors while elevating Middle Eastern ancestors, the colonizers deliberately cut Africans off from their own roots.
Yeah.
It forces a population to look outside of their own bloodline for divine validation. If your ancestors are demons, you have to adopt the colonizers' ancestors to be holy.
And the tragic part is that this toxic division, this psychological damage, is still playing out in the modern church system today. It didn't end when colonial rule ended.
No, it didn't. The author highlights the fierce denominational rivalries that exist right now. You have members of the Deeper Life Church who refuse to step foot in a celestial church because they claim it's demonic. You have redeemed church members avoiding Mountain of Fire and Miracles.
Right.
People will drive 4 hours past a dozen local churches just to attend their specific brand, completely forgetting that spirituality is supposed to be about connection to the divine, not a fierce territorial competition.
Which contrasts sharply with traditional African spirituality. According to the author, the traditional systems never fought religious wars to prove superiority. Whether practiced in the West, North, or South, it didn't rely on suppressing or insulting another belief system to thrive.
Exactly.
If a religion feels the constant need to pull down another belief system just to survive, the text argues that something is deeply wrong.
The author uses a really beautiful analogy here to explain this concept of unity and diversity, comparing the divine to a father.
Oh, I love this part.
Right. Imagine a man. To his employees, he might be a highly strict, demanding boss. To his own aging father, he's a quiet, respectful son. And to his little daughter, he's a playful, loving dad who sits on the floor and lets her braid his hair. Now, if the employee and the daughter start fiercely arguing over who the real man is, they are entirely missing the point.
Because they're both right. They just have entirely different context-specific relationships with him.
Exactly. The book's argument is that God revealing himself to the ancient Hebrews in one specific way and revealing himself to the ancient Africans through the Odu Ifa in another way doesn't make one better or more valid than the other. They are just different valid relationships with the exact same divine universe.
Wow. We have covered a lot of incredible ground today. From discovering that the Odu Ifa operates using the mathematical mechanics of a 256-chapter binary code to the linguistically verified ancient story of the virgin birth of Ela and his role as an intercessor.
And we looked at the third-day resurrection rituals of breaking the calabash and how the explosive, vibrant worship in modern African churches is actually a secret survival of Yoruba traditions disguised as Orthodox Christianity.
Yeah, and we explored the much darker mechanics of how empires operate, the deliberate psychological tactics used to demonize indigenous herbs, manipulate imagery, and shame the honoring of African ancestors in order to maintain absolute colonial control.
It is a massive structural reclamation of history. And the book claims that today, this reality is actually an open secret at the top.
Really?
Yeah, it claims that countless modern pastors secretly consult African spiritual priests behind closed doors for real power, all while being terrified of being caught by their own congregations.
That is wild.
But the author's ultimate message is that the average person no longer has to hide in the dark. With programs like the International College of Religion and Yoruba Studies, this hidden history is finally wide open and accessible. You don't need saving from your own culture.
Because the knowledge and the divine truth were always right there waiting for you in your own lineage.
Precisely.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into these incredibly provocative historical claims, I want to leave you with one final thought to really mull over on your own. We've just seen how a massive, complex spiritual system written in advanced binary code could be successfully marginalized and dismissed as primitive by mainstream history books for centuries.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder what other incredibly advanced indigenous knowledge systems around the world are currently hiding in plain sight, just waiting for us to finally translate them.
It is a profound question. It really challenges us to look at the world and our history with entirely fresh eyes.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning everything, keep exploring the roots of what you've been taught, and we'll catch you next time.